Travelling to the interpretation station, please alight now.
Episode 11 of the interpretation station is called to order. Please take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. How are we all doing? Is everyone good? I hope so. I've got three big questions to ask you ahead of today's show. The first is, who was the famous Simon Bolivar, he of the eponymous hero of the name of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela? Secondly, how can a diplomatic squabble between Turkish President Erdogan and German Chancellor Angela Merkel better help us understand the nature of the Spanish equivalent for crimes against humanity? And thirdly and finally, how can the acronym PMSL, yeah, you know the one you get on the internet, pissing myself laughing, why should that be essential knowledge before you embark on any statement about to be delivered by Venezuela? Well, stay tuned to find out the answer to all three of these questions and many more in the next hour of linguistics, wit, and repartee. Yes, so we've got Venezuela up today. So we're staying in South America. We were doing sort of Argentina last week. We're moving to Venezuela, which these days is probably the most entertaining Spanish-speaking country anywhere. It's with the most actions going on. It's what's keeping us in a job. That the sort of things. What's going on there. Now, just especially for the occasion, because it's Latin Americans, I've donned a rather fetching guayabera. You see it? You like that? Well, unfortunately, the bad thing is, it's actually it's a Filipino guayabera actually that I got given a couple of years ago. But well, it looks quite good. So it gives a bit of Latino atmosphere to the episode. So yes, Venezuela then. Today's speech that we've got, it's done by Kerry again. And we're going to be looking, it's a speech from last year, from, I believe, the summer of last year, or September 2019, discussing what are known these days as UCMs, unilateral coercive measures. And it's a speech by the well, he's the Minister of the People's Power of Foreign Affairs, we'll be hearing from. I think in English that means the Foreign Minister. So, what we're going to be doing, therefore, is I'm going to give you a little bit of just a little bit of background to the situation then in Venezuela before we start, so that you can get your bearings a little bit. And I guess the best place to start with any discussion of Venezuela in the modern era, at least, is with Mr. Hugo Chavez. You may recall him. He of general debate fame. I don't know if you recall several years back, maybe 10, pretty longer, maybe even 15 years ago, let's say, in the general debate, Mr. Chavez speaking there, he came not long after George W. Bush, and he famously uttered the words, I can't remember what they were in Spanish, but if I was to paraphrase them into Cockney English, they would sound something along the lines of, "God blimey, doesn't half stink of sulphur around here." Yeah, so he was comparing Bush to, well, Beelzebub, shall we say. So anyway, Chavez, yeah, he had some entertaining speeches, by the way. If you want to get some good practice in Latin American Spanish, do look up some of Chavez's old speeches, including that one from the general debate. Maybe if any of you are brave enough, you viewers, someone wants to do that one for me? do a rendering of it, and I'll do an episode on it if you like. Anyway, so Chavez, who first came to power, he was the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution, came to power initially in 1999, then with a slight hiatus in about 2002, 2003, pretty much ruled Venezuela all the way to his death in 2013. He wasn't that old when he died. I think he was in his late 50s when he died. So when he died, he was replaced. I believe when he died, he'd recently won an election, actually. Well, it hasn't been long after. So when he died, his vice president took over, his sort of dauphin, Nicolas Maduro, who in fact, Maduro, former bus driver. So that'll got to watch out for your bus drivers next time you're riding the number 31 back home, and you feel like giving the driver a bit of chip. Just remember, he might be a president one day. So Maduro, he took over as vice president, and then in 2018, you had the next presidential elections, where he basically Maduro ran as Chavez's successor. These were in May 2018. Now, Venezuelan elections are generally, you may be surprised to know, is that they generally tend to get pretty good marks for sort of election integrity. They've generally been rated pretty highly. It's all relative, I mean, to other countries, but you might be surprised to know that Venezuelan elections are generally they get a good score, and seemed all normal initially. So he won, but then the opposition started to complain. They started to accuse Maduro of rigging the vote, of buying votes, so on. And then the pressure built, this sort of this opposition built, and come late January of 2019, so last year, a certain Juan Guaido declares himself interim president of Venezuela. Now, this guy had been virtually unheard of. He was plucked from obscurity almost, and all of a sudden he was declaring himself interim president. And now Guaido, to give you a bit of background on him, so he was one of the founder members of the Popular Will Party, so Voluntad Popular. That was back in 2009. He was elected to the Venezuelan National Assembly in 2015. And in January last year, he was declared the speaker of the parliament. So the parliament is majority opposition controlled, which again you might find surprising, because again Venezuela, you generally under the impression that it's a big dictatorship, very centralized, all one party system. But anyway, their parliament is actually controlled by the opposition. Now, he was a junior member of the party, but many of the more senior figures in the party were either basically under house arrest, in exile, or in hiding. Perhaps the most famous of these leaders is a guy called Leopoldo Lopez. He's probably the most famous of them. But anyway, on 23rd January last year, Guaido declares himself interim president. And he does this citing a clause in the Venezuelan constitution that says that the leader of the assembly, of the legislature, becomes president when there is a vacuum of power. So basically, Guaido said that the situation created by the election, by Maduro taking power on the grounds of that rigged election, according to him, had created this vacuum of power. And it was on those grounds that he claimed the presidency. Now, since then, Maduro responded. So his assets were frozen in country. His movements have been restricted. He was arrested on January the 13th last year, but then he was quickly released because basically his declaration actually garnered a lot of support abroad. Obviously, most importantly, from the United States, which I believe was the first to recognize him as president of Venezuela, a situation that is ongoing today. They recognize Guaido as president. And it's not just the US, so pretty soon after, the European Union states all, I think, pretty much all recognized him. Certainly all the big players, France, Germany, Spain, Hungary. I'm just looking through at the list. Poland. Pretty much all the European Union states recognized him, as have a number of Latin American states. So Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, they've all recognized Guaido as president. Looking also, Canada has recognized him, Australia. So they've all recognized him. Now on the other side of the equation, the Russians and the Chinese have not recognized him. They still say that Maduro is the president. So it's the classic, split between, I guess, the West on the one hand and the states sort of more aligned with China and Russia on the other. The sort of classic fault line. So basically, Guaido has got himself a lot of at least support internationally, which it explains why, because he's still there, he's still in Venezuela, but basically Maduro doesn't really dare at this point to arrest him, let's say, because that really might trigger a sort of a Western intervention to topple him. So it's quite delicately poised, and has been since last year. There was so this actually, so it's this, as I say, the statement was made in April of 2019, and so this was really about the time that the protests were sort of, they maybe just past their peak, but it was still a big thing. You had an operation, for example, at the end of in April, 30th of April 2019, there was a big attempt, Guaido had a big push to try and topple Maduro in a sort of quasi-coup attempt. It's called Operation Liberty. That Operation Liberty, it's worth just remembering that. Just remember the name, okay? Just remember the name, because I've been hit with that in a statement by Venezuela when they refer to that sort of attempted coup. So just good to know what they're talking about. It's Operation Liberty. It was a failed, really, attempt to muster a sort of mass protests in Caracas, and a few people, there was a bit of gunfire here and there around Caracas. Few people were killed, but it never really picked up the momentum that Guaido was hoping for, and it was all sort of put down ultimately. So yeah, Maduro is still very much the guy in charge there. But what has happened in a big way over the last, well, since January last year, is that the West has really stepped up its sanctions against the Venezuelan government, and that's really what the gist of the statement is going to be about. We're going to have a look at that in a bit more detail. So that gives you a bit of a background to the situation in Venezuela. Just before we move to the actual listening to Kerry and to break down what she did for us, the answer to the first question I asked at the beginning, one of the questions, pissing myself laughing, PMSL. Why do I say that's a good thing to know before you do a Venezuelan statement? Well, Venezuelan statements tend to be very vivid, and they often tend to harangue the United States, especially the Trump government and its allies. And they're often peppered with words. When referring to the allies, they are peppered with words like puppet, minion, stooge, and lackey. Those are 4 words, you see, that you really want to have. They're really useful to have have in your pocket before you start a Venezuelan statement, because you know when they start referring to the allies, that's what they're going to be calling them. So yeah, in Spanish, as I say, when they speak, you'll hear them use words like los títeres or las marionetas. So yeah, remember PMSL. It'll help you. PMSL. 4 good words there to give you. So before we listen to the statement, obviously this is a good point for me, as always, to tell you what the best way to approach this episode, to get the full academic benefit of this episode. If you go to the description box under the video and open the description box, you will find a link there to the original statement delivered by the Venezuelan foreign minister, Mr. Jorge Arreaza Montserrat. Okay, your best thing to do is to follow the link to that statement and then record yourself interpreting the statement. And then you will also find in that description box a link to the text, the hard copy of the minister's statement. Print that off, and then watch the episode and see what you've done right, see what new things you've learned, and yeah, that's the way to make progress. I'll also put in the description box links to a couple of other related items that may be of use as well. Okay, a couple of articles that I found giving a sort of overview of the situation in Venezuela, so that's always handy as well. So anytime, next time you have to do a statement of Venezuela, it's coming, you can just quickly go to the interpretation station, find the Venezuela episode 11 Venezuela, click on it, find everything you need to know, all the important details. Okay, so before you, by the way, do your recording, I'll just give you just a couple of little hints for important vocab. All right. So know this acronym UCMs, unilateral coercive measures. Okay, you can call them UCMs, so they cover. It's all to do with sanctions. All right. Okay, so with that, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started then with Kerry's rendering of Mr. Jorge Arreaza Montserrat, 10th meeting of the 42nd regular session of the Human Rights Council. So let's hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and President Nicolas Maduro.
Okay, so big thing right at the start that I really need to sort of point out to you. So as Kerry rightly said, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Now, why is this important? Well, with most countries, the full constitutional name of the country isn't such a big deal, I mean, even with the UK, you can just call it the UK, okay? You don't have to call it the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Well, so you might want, I don't know, you can call it the United Kingdom first time, and then later in the text, just say the UK, the UK, the UK. Venezuela, it's different, slightly different, because that's a big deal for them, that name of the Bolivarian Republic, okay? So usually I would say to people, okay, call it the first time, and then don't worry about it. But with the Venezuelans, I think you want to try and say it as many times as you want, as many times as you can, rather. Because, I almost have the feeling that, okay, you mess something up in the text, all right? Let's say you get something wrong, or you don't miss some information. They've got their guys listening into you. I've got a feeling their guys are going, okay, they'll hear it, but then then having made a mess of something, let's say the speaker then refers again to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and you can say the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, I've got a feeling he's going to go easy on you. Okay, because I think that's one of the they want to be known as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I think that buys brownie points with them if you say that thing, because you don't want them to stop you. You don't want them to make, embarrass you by saying there's a problem. I think every time you manage to get in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, you score a little brownie point with them that's just going to make them slightly more look upon your work more favorably. Just my advice. Just before we go on, so who was Simon Bolivar? Well, you might know he was the guy, he was the great South American liberator. So he liberated what are today's the land area of Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama from the yoke, shall we say, of the Spanish Empire. So he was quite the conqueror, quite the liberator, and he's generally looked on very sympathetically by most South Americans in general. So the state he sought to establish was called Gran Colombia, and you can see a map of what that area covered. I mean, it didn't last for very long, Gran Colombia. It all sort of split up during the 19th century into its sort of all its constituent parts. It's the classic tale, you know. It's all these everyone wanted their own piece of the action, really, and that project all sort of all broke up. He's quite an interesting guy, actually, Bolivar. You might perhaps have the knee-jerk tendency to think that, you know, his name obviously really became internationally known with Chavez coming to power in Venezuela, you know, he was very much inspired by Bolivar, and I guess I was under the impression perhaps that Bolivar would be a man very similar to like Chavez. Okay, Chavez is known being very, very hard left, sort of Marxist, authoritarian. You know, that's the impression you get from the press, the media in the West. So you're sort of automatically inclined to think that Bolivar was probably a man after, you know, similar qualities, of similar characteristics. However, reading up on Bolivar, it's quite interesting, as I was doing preparation for this episode. So he was actually very much a man of the Enlightenment. You know, he was very sympathetic to just the revolution, in the French Revolution, but also the American Revolution, which is it's interesting, given, you know, that today, well, Venezuela and America are poles apart, the great enemy. But Bolivar was a pretty big admirer of the revolution, the American Revolution, when they broke away from the United Kingdom, and the ideas of, you know, he seems to have been very drawn by classical liberal ideas. So yeah, he you know, among his inspirations, he traveled an incredible amount of ground in his military operations. Apparently, he covered more ground than Hannibal in all his, you know, crossing the Andes several times to spread the sort of Latin American revolution. And it's interesting, as I say, he was some of the people, the thinkers of his day that he really admired were Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, which of course is considered, you know, one of the foundations. He's considered one of the founding fathers, I guess, of classical liberalism. Also Voltaire, Montesquieu. So it's interesting. I mean, in Wikipedia, they say that his Bolivian constitution placed him within the camp of what would become Latin American conservatism in the later 19th century. So it's just interesting to know it's interesting that Chavez sort of is inspired by this guy. You would think that ideologically, when you sort of look into it, there are similarities, there are differences, but Bolivar. He sounds like an interesting guy. I think that what's important is, so he saw what happened in North America, and he admired it, but he thought that it couldn't be replicated in South America. So obviously the idea in North America, in the United States, was a sort of fairly loose federation of, with all these of the individual states, a fairly decentralized model of power, whereas he thought this wouldn't be workable in South America. So he thought that Gran Colombia, a United States, South America, would have to be a much more centralized republic. I think he thought that the mentality of Latin Americans was different to their sort of northern cousins, shall we say, that the same model that sort of was working in North America couldn't just be replicated in South America. So again, I'd encourage you to have a read about him. He sounds like an interesting guy. So anyway, with that little brief digression, let's carry on.
We welcome this opportunity to underscore that recently the non-aligned movement adopted a resolution.
Okay, the non-aligned movement. This is they're quite important players at the UN. They're a sort of alliance of the countries that during the Cold War decided that more or less stayed neutral. Okay, so you had the West led by the US and the countries of the East led by the Soviet Union, but you had a lot big group of countries who stayed neutral in it. Chiefly countries like India, Pakistan, a lot of the Latin American countries. I believe it was founded by Tito, president of Yugoslavia. He was the one who, it was his initiative. Anyway, what's useful to know here is, okay, in the text, they call it Movimiento de Países No Alineados. And I think he does call them NAM throughout the text when he refers to them. However, you should also know one other acronym that's used for them, and it's called, if you ever hear OPANAL, now that can really, the first time you hear it, can really throw you, what the hell is OPANAL? Well, OPANAL is Organización de Países No Aliados. So OPANAL. So I don't, sometimes they seem to, sometimes they call it the movimiento, sometimes the organización, but I've heard OPANAL used pretty recently. So just watch out for that. Just be careful if ever you hear that. They are a significant player at the UN. They're a group that wields quite a bit of influence.
To insist that states should refrain from applying unilateral coercive measures which are contrary to international law.
Okay, just a couple of little things here. Dejen de aplicar, so as Kerry said, refrain from, abstain from. It's always a good one just to remember those. And then, so we have this unilateral coercive measures, medidas coercitivas unilaterales. So yeah, give it, the first time round, give it the full name, okay? But after that, feel free to use that acronym, UCMs, right? Contrarias al derecho internacional, again, that run counter to international law. It's always good to have these little words again, like little simple words like contrarias, for example, at odds with, that are at odds with international law is another possible one. You can say that they're contrary to international law as well, I guess.
This position of the Council dovetails with the criteria laid down by the UN General Assembly.
Now, on a completely different, on the opposite side of the other side of the coin, on plena sintonia. Okay, so that what Kerry used, very nice. Dovetails with, that's very nice. I mean, more standard sort of solutions would be, consistent with, in keeping with, in line with, in step with. You have a whole host of possible solutions there. But again, it's always nice just to stop for a moment and think about what are they again. Because every now and then you do get stuck for no good reasons. Nothing will come to you. So it's always good just to keep them turning over. That's why I point these things out.
And by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Okay, so there we have it. That's the Spanish equivalent. Oficina de la Alta Comisionada para los Derechos Humanos. They very rarely use the acronym, I find, the Spanish. Okay. I can't ever remember them saying OACDH. ACDH? I think so in French, by the way, just since we're talking about it, HCDH. That is the OHCHR. So yeah, the Haut Commissaire des Droits de l'Homme, so in French. That's thrown me. I mean, I've worked in Geneva a lot. It took me a while for that to settle. I always was confusing it with the HRC, the Human Rights Council, le CDH. So the Human Rights Council is le CDH. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is HCDH. Okay, so in French it can be a bit confusing, but yeah, in Spanish they don't tend to use the synonym often.
Unilateral coercive measures are not contained in this charter.
Okay, so here, Kerry's, you can use the full unilateral coercive measure. I suspect she perhaps didn't actually know that you could get away with using the acronym. But for a text like this, yeah, you want to be, that's going to save you a lot of time. That's going to give you a lot of breathing space if you use that acronym.
Which guides us all as members of the United Nations.
Okay, just rige from the infinitive regir, so Kerry says guides us, which we're governed by, which governs us. Yeah, either one of those is nice.
This morning, in a biennial panel that we had on this topic, the representative of Fiji said that unilateral coercive measures are irrational, illogical, and contrary to the spirit of the United Nations.
Okay, so there's that word in contrarias. So she said contrary this time. So again, it's good to have 2 or 3 alternatives in your pocket just to sort of change things up a bit. So contrary to the spirit, run counter to the spirit. Inconsistent with the spirit.
However, the government of the United States of America, the supremacist government of Mr. Donald Trump, imposes unilateral coercive measures on Venezuela and other countries without any moral grounds for doing so.
Okay, so she's added, it's good how she's added moral grounds. So in the original, as you see, there's no grounds. It just says tipo de moral para hacerlo. So sometimes in English, you have to, you have to throw in a word occasionally just to make it sound a bit more natural.
As rightly stated by Dr. Idris Jazari, Special Rapporteur on the Negative Impact of Unilateral Coercive Measures, in his report presented to this 42nd session of the Council.
Okay, so always remember, when I heard the name, when I was doing this text myself, I completely missed the guy's name. So sometimes you can just say the special, as well as stated, as pointed out by the special rapporteur. You can make a stab at the name. You might get it horribly wrong, or you can sort of play safe and just give him his job title. Various. That's you got to do what you've got to make that sort of judgment call in the moment. And then yes, she leaves out. So en su informe consignado en esta 42ª sesión. So she skips consignado as you can. This is his report to this 42nd session.
The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has been a victim of this type of measures by the US government for about a decade.
Okay, so Kerry wins her brownie point there from the Venezuelan delegation. She got in the Bolivarian Republic.
To be more specific, the Special Rapporteur said since the year 2005. The goal is very clear: to bring the Venezuelan economy to its knees.
Okay, so she said to bring the economy to its knees. We could have to collapse the economy, to take down the Venezuelan economy, one of those.
to prevent the state from meeting the basic needs of its population, and to promote regime change by unconstitutional and forceful means in Venezuela.
Okay, that's nice how she goes with, so satisfacer las necesidades básicas, so to meet the basic needs of the population, and yep, to provoke regime change. This is something, that's often talked about, triggering, sparking regime change. This is often what the Americans are accused of in various countries.
The special rapporteur said, and I quote, "Unilateral economic sanctions adopted by the United States and other countries, alongside a multifaceted economic war."
This is good. So often when I come to when I do quotations, I'll tend to at the end I'll say quote unquote. I'll read the quotation out and say quote unquote at the end. That's one way of doing it. So Kerry's gone for you. He said, I quote this. So it's up to you. It's up to you. Okay. Sumadas a una guerra económica polifacética. So she's alongside a multifaceted economic war. So that's nice. Often I go with sumada when it's something along these lines. I'll talk about coupled with. I like using that. Coupled with something else.
Have played an undeniable role in paralyzing the Venezuelan economy.
It's not, yeah, so desdeñable. Desdeñable. So undeniable. So I tripped up a little bit of that when I did it myself. I said something about undoubtable, which doesn't, well, I suppose you get the idea, but I think undeniable is better.
Measures against Venezuela include the freezing of assets belonging to the Republic.
It's an important concept to know. And then, okay, congelación de los activos. So yeah, they often talk about asset freeze, especially when it comes to sanctions. So that's one of the main pillars generally of international sanctions: asset freezes of property belonging to a government, assets that are kept abroad. Another one is a travel ban. When you hear of sanctions, you want to expect that these are two issues that are going to come up: asset freezes and travel bans.
In the United States, a large Venezuelan energy company, Citgo, was seized and robbed. It was attacked by the US government.
Okay, so a couple of these words here: fue robada, fue asaltada. So it was robbed, it was attacked, as Kerry said. So I was thinking, yeah, they often talk about, the Venezuelans will often talk about, the Americans or big corporations plundering resources. So when they say robada, that's a good word to know, to have maybe plunder. I was thinking mugged. Could you say mugged in this case? It was mugged. Maybe it's the wrong register, but I like plunder. It was given a shakedown. That sounds a bit Hollywood-esque, but could work.
A company whose value exceeded $12 billion.
Okay, so here's the first of these big numbers, as promised. So that's good. 12,000 millones, so 12 billion. So yeah, it's annoying. I know in Spanish they talk about thousands of millions. So that's what, yeah, be careful there. There's more to come.
With that money, we could have paid for 5 full years of food and medicine for the people of Venezuela. However, in addition to blocking our funds and money, in various banks around the world, more than $7 billion have been blocked.
Okay, there's the second figure coming in. 7,000 millones de dólares. So 7 billion. And you can't, there's not really much room to make a mistake in this, because there's a big difference between 7 million and 7 billion. So if you say 7 million, there's a good chance you'll get someone will hear that and say, hang on, that doesn't sound too much. 7 billion does, though.
Here in Switzerland, our diplomats, both at the bilateral embassy and at the mission, have had their accounts blocked and they cannot use them.
Here, this almost threw me a little bit. Yeah, he talks about a la embajada bilateral. So all he means there is just the. So obviously in Geneva, you've got to be aware you have the mission, like the embassy, just the regular embassy. I guess is quite. But also because in Geneva you have all these international organizations, including the UN. You have the mission. You have a separate mission to. Often it's called to UNOG, to the UN, and the other Geneva institutions. So that's simply the difference that he's talking about.
Those $7 billion are equivalent to 30 times the amount required by the UN to finance a humanitarian response plan, which has been prepared in recent months in Venezuela.
Okay, equivaldrían, so yeah, are equivalent to, are equal to, tantamount to, maybe?
Humanitarian aid has seen attempts to use it as a weapon against Venezuelan sovereignty, said Special Rapporteur Jazairi.
This little word, okay, usar, used as a weapon against sovereignty. Perfectly fine just to say use. But you're about to hear it, they're going to use it twice, as well as utilizar. Sometimes it's handy with this word to have a couple of alternatives that are a bit more nuanced. So this is more than in fact just being used, it's sort of being exploited. This humanitarian assistance is what's being used. But what's actually happening is being exploited, it's being manipulated. So it's good again to have a couple more alternatives. It will impress the listeners more.
Arguably, attempts to use humanitarian supplies to exacerbate tensions in Venezuela.
Okay, so for podría sostenerse que, so Kerry's gone for arguably, which it's that's nice. It deals with those three words in one. I was thinking, okay, if you do the sort of like for like translation, it could be argued that, or it could be posited. It could be posited that, to posit. That's quite a very high register word that you might like to think about. And suministros humanitarios. That's an important word again. That you might not get without thinking about it. So supplies, suministros humanitarios. You might sort of get lost thinking, oh, provisions or something. The key word you need is supplies, humanitarian supplies.
And ultimately to cause a regime change are contained in the definition of unilateral coercive measures.
Okay, so again, she's quoting the special rapporteur, comprendidos en la definición, so yeah, contained in the definition, covered by the definition.
There are no exceptions. It is false that there are any exceptions for the procurement of medicine.
That's nice. La compra, procurement of medicine. Perhaps the purchase of medicine is perhaps the most natural thing we'd say in English.
For humanitarian needs, no exception.
Para los saneamientos humanitarios. Okay, saneamientos. Yeah, you can say sanitation. She says, okay, just got with humanitarian needs. That's okay. I'm just thinking more specifically what the best way to go for here would be. For humanitarian medication, sanitation. Okay, so carrying on.
When the World Bank, due to overcompliance, or as of the sanctions of August 2019, when they do this directly for fear of secondary coercive measures, when they...
Okay, so this is quite a tricky moment because he throws in an English word here that you're not really expecting. He says, cuando la banca internacional por el overcompliance. And my initial thought was the International Bank for Over-Compliance. I'd never heard of that one. But he's obviously saying because of over-compliance. So that's something to look out for, that sometimes these foreign delegations, they're speaking, and they throw an English word in, and that's the thing that completely throws you. You're fine doing, you're interpreting, they throw this English word in that you're not expecting, and lo and behold, you're suddenly, what's going on? And anyway, so then he goes on to talk about secondary coercive measures. Now, this, just out of interest, I mean, this is of going into the details, basically, of the nature of the sanctions regime that the US has established against Venezuela. So it really introduced those sanctions. Initially, it was Obama that introduced them in March 2015. And then Trump stepped them up in 2017, and then really stepped them up in 2019 after all the troubles there. And this thing he's referring to, secondary coercive measures. What it's basically to do with, I've found an interesting article on the subject that I'm going to link to. It's called marinelink.com. Anyway, it's a sort of a lawyer explaining it. Basically, it's that any company that's doing business, so any, say, American company that's doing business with any sanctioned individual, in fact, an SDN is the acronym that's used, a specially designated national. So now that could either be an individual or a commercial entity. And it doesn't even have to be based in Venezuela. These can be based outside Venezuela. Any American company that's doing business with them can itself be subject to secondary sanctions. So some of these banks, I think that what he's getting at is that some of these banks are terrified of doing any business with the Venezuelans because they could be deemed to be breaking the sanctions regime that is in place. So that is, so sanctions, regular sanctions, they target the government, the main officials, the president, whatever. But these secondary sanctions, they target your own entities, your own businesses, whatever, that are deemed to be doing business with these specially designated nationals. So yeah, for more details, look in the description box.
Deny access to our country, the state cannot buy luxury goods or medicine or food, no treatments, nothing that could help the people of Venezuela to overcome the sanctions.
Okay, this is all fairly straightforward stuff. It's very well, crisply done by Kerry. Elementos de lujo, so luxury goods.
Every time that unilateral coercive measures are imposed in a general fashion, there is a negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights of the inhabitants in the state subject to the measures.
So again, she'd have been doing herself a big favor. She'd been using the old UCMs, but okay, she's still interpreting very nicely. So just this bit here, sujeto de las medidas. You could say, okay, she said subject to the measures that are targeted by these measures. It's another alternative.
And this is worst felt by the poorest and the most vulnerable. Unilateral coercive measures, the misnamed sanctions.
I like that. Misnamed for mal llamadas sanciones. Misnamed, ill-named, maybe you could say in English.
Kill. They cause suffering and they kill human beings in the countries where they are applied.
Again, all pretty straightforward here. If you compare the text and what Kerry's doing here, it's all very accurate interpreting.
And then the impact of these sanctions is used to accuse the state.
So here comes usar once again, okay? So this is what it goes, picks up on what I was saying earlier about having a few different options for usar other than just the boring use. So again, exploited or manipulated would be good in this case.
That is the victim of them in international fora, and to justify application of the so-called responsibility to protect.
So here comes this important concept that keeps rearing its ugly head: responsibility to protect. I think I've mentioned this in a previous video. I can't remember which one, but yeah. So this is the famous notion that can be shortened to R to P, and it's often used as a controversial instrument that has been used to, to justify, to sort of set the stage for foreign intervention. It's basically, it's used by, say, it's generally been an instrument that's been invoked by the West to say, that human rights violations are taking place in a given country, and that we need to go in militarily to put an end to those violations. So it's a very, very controversial notion that generally the Chinese and the Russians are opposed to.
We should note that in Venezuela, in spite of the blockade, in spite of sanctions, President Nicolas Maduro has undertaken a policy called the Plan to Care for Victims of the Blockade and Economic War.
Okay, so this is this plan, la Plan de Atención a las Víctimas del Bloqueo y de la Guerra Económica, which, as Kerry rightly calls it, the plan of care to the victims of the blockade and the economic war. So it's similar actually to what this is sort of also picks up on, relates to the blockade against Cuba, which has been in place for about 60 years now. The similar sort of sanctions regimes that was imposed against them. So there's quite a lot of parallels between the situation currently in Venezuela and sort of historically the situation in Cuba.
We are helping this vulnerable population, the worst affected by the measures.
Yendo a esas poblaciones vulnerables. Okay, we're helping the population. I think we're reaching them. We're reaching out to them. Reaching them is perhaps the best.
Case by case, one by one, to help them to move forward and overcome difficulties.
Atender los casos. So that's basically to address case by case. Okay, atender is to deal with, handle. Handle's a good word.
Yesterday, President Maduro awarded 2.8 million houses.
Okay, so more numbers coming in here. El día de ayer, if you want to give it just a little bit more emphasis, a little bit more nuance than just yesterday, you can see just yesterday President Maduro did this. Just tiny little bit of nuance. It probably won't be noticed in a meeting, but if you set an exam, I suspect the examiner might notice that you've picked up on that little nuance.
That is to say, 15 million Venezuelans are living in new homes in Venezuela. In a total population of 30 million, that is half the population.
Okay, so she does like these figures well. 2.8 million homes delivered, 15 million Venezuelans living in the new homes, total population 30 million.
Alongside this, we have worked closely with various UN agencies present in the country to draw up a humanitarian response plan.
Okay, elaborar un plan de respuesta humanitaria. So that's nice what Kerry said, to draw up. This elaborar, this will be one of these words that I keep picking up, telling you every time. Just don't say elaborate. We've elaborated. That just sounds so bad in English. Drawn up, developed, drafted, lots of other alternatives.
Which allows us to use UN institutions to overcome financial barriers.
This little expression, hacer uso, again, so Kerry's gone with use. I mean, it's fair enough, if you're under pressure. An expression that I really like in this context is to draw on the Okay, in this instance, it's draw on the institutionality of the UN, but to draw on capacities, draw on skills. Make a mental note of that to draw on. And then sortear los obstáculos financieros. So sortear is to sort of, to get around, to negotiate. You negotiate obstacles. I mean, that's classical English, as opposed to just sort of overcoming obstacles, to negotiate obstacles, to negotiate difficulties. To circumvent is another very, very nice one. I mean, you can just, again, say overcome, to get over. But I'm trying to broaden your options.
And now this plan, according to information from OCHA, this does not have the necessary resources. Donors have not been present.
Okay, OCHA, she mentions OCHA. That's the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Okay, if you're wondering, OCHA. And I think they use the same acronym in the other languages. And then, so los donantes no se han hecho presentes. What occurred to me for this, so I guess donors have pledged money, presumably, but they haven't stepped up, I think is the word we perhaps like to use in this context. They haven't stepped up to the plate.
In spite of all of the pressure on Venezuela, including the sad episode of the 23rd of February this year, where there was an attempt to push across supposedly humanitarian aid, it was neither humanitarian nor aid, from the United States across the Colombian border.
Okay, this was a bit of a controversial, another controversial incident last year on the border, as I say, with Colombia. Guaido's people had been stockpiling lots of humanitarian aid on the Colombian side of the border, and then there were various protests started to kick off, clashes started. So I think Maduro is accusing Guaido of organizing that as a bit of a publicity stunt to sort of garner attention from the world media, and to sort of show himself as wanting to he was wanting to provide the aid, and then that he was being blocked from doing so from Maduro. So that was the sort of context of the incident in question.
Nothing that the US does, or any empire, will make us give up our legitimate right to self-determination or give up an inch of our sovereignty.
Okay, so here the guy says, nada de lo que los Estados Unidos o el imperio. Okay, so Kerry says that as any empire. So usually when they talk about el imperio, basically it's a sort of synonym for the United States, the empire. You can just say the empire. It's a bit like it's a bit Star Wars, isn't it? But you just say the empire. Renunciar is to, Kerry says, to give up our legitimate right, or you can say to forego their right, to surrender their right.
The people of Venezuela will be aided by reason and law.
Okay, here's a classic case where you have this dilemma of whether to use the like-for-like translation rendering or the Queen's English rendering. So el pueblo venezolano le asiste la razón el derecho. So it will be aided, okay, by the law and by reason. So yeah, you could say that, and I'm sure it'll be fine with the Venezuelans, particularly if you've been saying your Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. But if you want to say the Queen's English, what occurred to me you can say is that the Venezuelan people have a reason and law on their side. Now that would sound really nice. Okay. So, but again, if you have the text before you, you can try it. It's gonna be a lot. I mean, okay, it's gonna be a lot tougher to pull something like that off without the text, but there's something. There's have a think about that one.
Now is the time for multilateralism. In the panel that we held this morning, there was an attempt to promote from the NAM a resolution in the UN.
Okay, so Kerry just calls the movement there. I think the guy says in the original El Nam. So you don't need to say. You can just call it as Nam. Nam is the recognized sort of. That's the stock name for them, for the non-aligned movement.
Which hopefully, as Professor Ziegler was saying, would be more than a resolution, but rather a treaty.
Ojalá. So that's that bit of Arab. These sort of Arabic words. I think they get quite that the Spanish language abounds with. So yep, hopefully that's how you want to do ojalá. But you can say that we trust will that we trust will be. But yeah, hopefully is better. Hopefully is very good.
Where there would be prohibition, as a violation of the Charter, a prohibition of using unilateral coercive measures.
If you want an alternative to prohibition, I know that's the obvious sort of calc to go for, and there's nothing wrong with it. I'll sometimes like to talk about outlawing. UCMs would be outlawed. Okay. Banned, and there's always ban.
Last year, Alfred de Sayas, the special rapporteur on an equitable democratic international order, was...
That's what he is. He is the special rapporteur on equitable democratic order. So that's exactly what his job title is.
In Venezuela, and he concluded that UCMs in our country are...
Oh, so I tell a lie. So she does know UCM, so she's used it there. So that's very good.
crimes against humanity. The Chancellor of Iran...
Okay. So this brings me one of the questions I asked at the start. Okay. So UCMs constituyen delitos de lesa humanidad. Now, I've known this lesa humanidad, that it's crimes against humanity, for a long time. But I've always wondered, what is this lesa? What's that to do with? So I looked it up, and it's like if you go to word reference, for example, it will tell you damages against. Okay, so it's and there's a French equivalent, which is, in fact, no, I saw the crime. There's a crime called lesa majestad. And I'd never heard it in Spanish, but in French, I had heard of the crime, the crime of lèse majesté. And that crime is when you basically insult the head of state of a foreign country. And it was that crime, if you like, it was talked about quite a lot 2 or 3 years ago when Erdogan, I believe, visited Germany to meet with Merkel. And I think there was a German comedian who was pretty scathing of Mr. Erdogan. And I can't remember if he sort of satirized him on a TV show or cartoons or something. Anyway, Erdogan was very angry about the whole business. And there was talk of this guy. Initially, this guy was going to be prosecuted for the crime of basically lèse majesté, insulting the head of state. I believe the charges were dropped, and I don't think they ever went through with it in the end. But all that just to say that made sense to me what this meant. This crímenes de lesa humanidad. It's against. That's basically what lesa means, against. Injuring something. Anyway, there you go. There's a bit of a nugget for you. And then he goes, this is an important bit, that this little next bit. Let me just play it for you again. There's one word here that I want you to listen out for.
Against humanity. The Chancellor of Iran called them measures of economic terrorism.
Okay, so Kerry said that, so in the Spanish, it's El Canciller de Iran. Okay, the Chancellor of Iran. Now, certainly the Latin Americans, they tend to use canciller for the foreign minister. And they talk about la cancelaria is the foreign ministry. So that's that's a bit of a Latin American specialty. I don't know what the origin of that is, but be aware that when the Latin Americans talk about el canciller, it's not the chancellor. Usually, I don't know what they call speaking of Angela Merkel, I'm not quite certain if she's el canciller, but certainly generally when they say el canciller de Iran, that would be the foreign minister. Okay.
And we would agree with that assessment. We insist that they kill. In Cuba, it has been calculated that the cost of the blockade and the unilateral measures that they have suffered for 60 years come almost to $1 billion, or rather $1 trillion in English.
Okay, so here's the tricky one. Un billón. So billón in Spanish, and he's very helpful here because the minister, because then he says, which in English is, you say, $1 trillion. Maybe he's worried that it will cause a bit of confusion, but yeah, you got to watch out for that. So when they say in Spanish billón, they're actually meaning our trillion.
These countries ought to be compensated as...
So indemnizado, so she rightly says compensated. Indemnified, it's a bit of an old word. We don't really use that much in English, do we? I think, yeah, compensated is the best.
Recommended by various bodies of this council.
Órganos de ese consejo, so bodies of this council is very good. You can say organs maybe, but bodies. Again, this is one of these words that's going to come up, keeps coming up, and it's always just useful to remind you what the best way to deal with it is.
And finally, we would like to underscore that there is a need to reconsider whether members of the Human Rights Council...
Okay, it's an interesting word, revisar, and it's about to come up a couple of times here. And so Kerry goes here with reconsider, and in the context here, that's good. However, well, you know what? We'll wait till we come to the second time, and they'll use it in the next paragraph, and I'm going to come back to it. Okay.
Can be accomplices in the imposition of unilateral coercive measures.
Okay, cómplices de la imposición. So yes, accomplices. Could they, if you really wanted to get fancy in English, could they be considered to be aiding and abetting the imposition? But again, I think this is one of those cases where it's just easier to go for the perfectly legitimate calque with accomplices.
There should not be any formal member of the council who imposes unilateral coercive measures, and they should...
Just to give you an alternative, if you're sick of using impose for imponer, to foist works pretty well generally.
There should be no members who facilitate the imposition of secondary measures, secondary sanctions, and there should also be no members in this council who fail to condemn and who do not speak out against unilateral coercive measures.
Okay, so that's nice how she goes with this fail to. Okay, because this is quite a tricky sentence. There shouldn't be any members who do not, so he says, who do not condemn, and then no se atreva a condenar, so to give it extra emphasis, that's who fail to condemn. I mean, I guess atreverse is like to dare, but in English it's doesn't really sound very good. There should be no members who do not dare to condemn these measures. I don't know, it sounds, doesn't sound normal in English. So yeah, that's a good one. To fail to do something, that's well done.
Because perhaps they're not violating human rights in your territory, but this facilitates and promotes and violates human rights in the territory of third countries. And this should prevent them morally from being members of this council.
Just one tiny thing there. It's always quizás no estarán violando derechos humanos en su territorio. So Kerry rightly says, in your territory. You have to remember, of course, with the Latin Americans, with their when they go into their second person and their third person tend to be the same. When they're saying, in Latin American Spanish, they call you. They don't call you vosotros. They say usted, which is like, so they use that both for the second person singular and third person. So sometimes you have to watch out for that. So they're not maybe not violating human rights you might initially think in su territorio, in his territory, but it's actually in your territory. So always just be aware of that little nuance again with the Latin Americans, that they use for the second and third persons the same sort of personal pronouns. And then, did we finish that paragraph?
We think...
Okay, so yeah, I was going to say impediría moral y éticamente ser. So if they were to do that, this would this would morally and ethically impede them from becoming members of this council, stop them from being members, or perhaps even preclude is a nice alternative. Preclude them from being members. Well, he's saying that basically if they fail to condemn the sanctions, any state would then preclude themselves from being a member. And now turning to the last paragraph, we're almost there.
That the criteria for election to this council should be revised based on countries' positions on unilateral measures. Thank you very much.
So just to finish off with then, we have this revisar coming up again here. Creemos que hay que revisar los criterios para la elección de los Estados miembros. So here, reconsider. So Kerry's gone with revise here, which could work. It's fine. Reconsider here, I don't think would sound as good. To reconsider the criteria. Basically, what I think is a good word perhaps to use that fits in perhaps that's maybe the most versatile is to revisit. To revisit the criteria, revisit the conditions. It's a very formal sounding word. I doubt you revisit many things in your everyday lives, but at the UN, that's a good word to have handy, to revisit. Also review, but again, it's not quite got the same. We need to review the criteria. That doesn't necessarily suggest there's going to be any changes made. Whereas if you say to revisit, I think that there's a sort of implication in that word to revisit that things are going to be changed. So that brings us to an end then of that statement. So I hope you found that useful. I think there was a lot of useful vocabulary in there for you to draw on. So what were my highlights then of this text? And so to finish today's lesson, a new section, new special call. I'm going to call it my magic moments. I know I've been calling this part of the show in the past my highlights. I was thinking, need something a bit more interesting than that. So, okay, this is my magic moments from the show. So, magic moment number one for you to remember. Okay, these are the real things for you to take away from this show. The first phrase, in sintonia. So in accordance with, in harmony with, in keeping with. That's a phrase that comes up quite a bit, and it's a good one to know. And sometimes, here's a bonus for you, in sintonía con la naturaleza, you can say at one with nature. Okay. Magic moment number two. This is a very important one to remember, as I said during the show. El canciller or la cancillera, I think in this case it was el canciller de Iran, foreign minister. Make sure to remember that, because especially, if the foreign minister's in the room and then the delegate of another country says, la canciller de ese país, whatever, and they say, the chancellor of that country, your man, he's not going to understand what he means. He's going to think, Chancellor, where's Angela Merkel? No, so okay, canciller, foreign minister. Magic moment number 3, last but not least, the verb revisar, okay? So to revisit, I really want you to think about using that word, revisit, or again, you've got review, reconsider can work very nicely as well. That's a very important word, very important. It's one that maybe gets overlooked sometimes, but you need to have a, you can say take a second look at as well. But it's just important that you don't trip up on it. That's what's most important with that word, revisar. Okay, so that's it. So I hope you've enjoyed the show. If you haven't done so already, consider subscribing. Click on the subscribe button there. If you liked the show, if you enjoyed it, click the thumbs up button. Smash the thumbs up button, as my son always tells me I've got to say. What else? Yes, if you've got any work, if you'd like to take part in an episode, if you want to be the guinea pig for an episode, please do send me your work. Send me in a text. It's you choose any text that you've done. A good record, a recording that you're pleased with, and I'm just going to use it as the sort of basis, as the sort of template for the show. So you get a free lesson out of it. Okay, so please do send in anything you've got. Comment anything you liked on the show in particular, or any words, any suggestions, any criticisms, even stuff maybe you don't like. Put it in the comments. Okay, well. That pretty much brings us to the end. So with that, all that remains to be said is that episode 11 of the Interpretation Station is adjourned. Bye-bye. See you next time.
The train is now leaving the interpretation station. We hope you enjoyed your visit. Until next time, folks.